Instability, injustice, confusion, all of the common ills of society. Factions of individual interests embed themselves in government and attack the freedom of the rest of the population. How do these conditions arise? How do we prevent them? And can we form a society free of these problems? These are the questions we'll be looking at today as we take a look at what the father of the Constitution, James Madison, has to say about properly forming a government. What's up, and welcome back to the fourth installment on my series on the Federalist Papers. And today we'll be discussing what I think is one of the most important in the whole body of work, and that is James Madison's first submission to the papers, Federalist 10, which deals with factions and the principles of representative republics. So if you're just jumping into the series now and you don't know what the Federalist Papers are, they're a series of essays and letters written to New York newspapers by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay that argue in favor of the adoption of the American Constitution. If you want a deeper explanation about what these are, go check out my first video in the series. And if you want to read these for yourself, which I highly recommend, I always have links in the description of where you could either read them or listen to the audio version for free. So go ahead and check that out too. So since this is the first time James Madison has actually come up, I was going to put in a little part here about who he is and give you a little context there. But I decided instead of doing that to make two short videos about him. So if you want that context, go ahead and check out those shorts. But other than that, we're ready to jump into the summary of Federalist 10. We see Publius return in Federalist 10, now assuming his third and final personality of James Madison, to give us an incredible breakdown of the principles of republicanism, that is, of the form of representative republics, not of the modern GOP of today. Although that's not to say he doesn't address the GOP at all. That's because the topic he's addressing here is factions, which he defines as a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So basically, a group of people who are going to act against the well-being of their society to achieve their own personal goals. And of course, as is the purpose of all these papers, Madison is going to argue that the Union, Constitution, and the government that it prescribes is the best solution to factionism as well as any other problems that might arise in a popular government. And something that I really like here is that he acknowledges that the Constitution is not by any means going to be perfect at preventing factions, but it's the best that we got. And rejecting it because you think it should be perfect is unreasonable. I think it's worth noting here that he offers us no distinction between a faction as compared to a political party. Most of the founding fathers were very against parties. They thought they were degrading to democracy. But for our purposes here, I think it's safe to kind of define it as a party is a faction, but without the bad intentions to the rest of the population, or just kind of a group of people that pursue their interests, while a faction does it hostily. He points out that the ills the nation had been facing up until this point couldn't be entirely explained by the inefficiencies of the Articles of Confederation or of external forces interfering. In particular, he blames the lack of public confidence as well as threats to personal property, mostly, if not entirely, on factions, or what we've been calling up until this point individual interests. Now, I hope that at this point you can kind of see the picture that I'm painting here, even if this is your first video in the series. I'm not really being subtle about it. The more I read about our history and compare it to our contemporary situation, the more I learn about the founding fathers, and the more I read their words, the more I realize that we're in the midst of an attempted conspiracy against we, the people of the United States. And I think it's really important that we all acknowledge that and also acknowledge who is doing it, who the individual interests are. They're the rich oligarchs within the union. I normally leave comments like that for the end of the video, but I felt like I needed to bring it up right there. Obviously, we'll expand on that later in the analysis. Madison offers us two methods of getting rid of factions and the ramifications of each. The first method would be to take away the liberty that enables factions to form. He likens liberty to the air that fuels the fire of factions, but he also acknowledges that this solution is, in fact, worse than the disease. That's because there's an even greater inferno that liberty fuels, that of freedom in society and political life. Without liberty, we'd free ourselves from factions, but in doing so, we'd lose the very thing we sought to protect from them. The second solution he offers is to give every man the same thoughts, opinions, and interests. This also cannot be done, because of the same liberty that we've already established must be defended, and he says that as long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. Furthermore, as long as human reason is connected to their self-love, interests, opinions, and passions, different interests are also going to be formed. These different interests, as well as the abilities that individuals possess, will lead to differences in the acquisition of property and increase the amount of differences among them. All of this leads to different parties and factions forming. So I'm going to read a passage here that offers a little bit more material analysis of factions and their causes. The latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man, and we see them everywhere brought into different degrees of activity according to the different circumstances of civil society. A zeal for different opinions concerning religion, concerning government, and many other points, as well as of speculation as of practice, an attachment to different leaders ambitiously contending for preeminence and power, or to the persons of other descriptions whose fortunes have been interesting to the human passions, have, in turn, divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosity, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. So strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and excite their most violent conflicts. But the most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations, and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests forms the principal task of modern legislation, and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. This passage is incredible to me because Madison lands on an analysis that's foundational to Adam Smith, the father of economics, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, liberalism, as the founders and other Enlightenment philosophers defined it, as well as Karl Marx, who of course needs no introduction. And this is something that we're also going to touch on later. He goes on to describe how individuals cannot act as a judge in their own case because they have a vested interest in the outcome. And he says that the point is even more true when you apply it to groups of people rather than individuals. And here is where he points out the contradiction of legislation, that it must necessarily be judged and passed by parties that have vested interests in it. If there's a law that's to be debated, say about loans, there's certainly going to be a faction of debtors on one side of the argument as well as creditors on the other. And because of these interests on both sides, it will certainly not be debated with only the public good in mind, as it should be. On top of this, the majority will always be able to overburden the minority in any issue, but he points out taxation as the most important and tempting way that the majority can abuse the minority. Now, this is a problem of factions, but as we pointed out earlier, you can never actually get rid of factions and their causes. So, what can we do about it? Well, in the case of a faction in the minority, that's an easy solution. The principles of republics and democracy will handle them, as they won't be able to gain power without the majority on their side. For a faction that's taken root in the majority, however, a simple democracy would never be able to overcome it. This is because you need to do one of two things to be able to beat a majority faction. Either prevent the same interest from ever forming in the majority in the first place, or prevent the majority from ever being able to take power. Of course, a simple democracy can never overcome this because every person in the society has a vote, and the majority will simply take power. Madison sees representative republics as the solution to this problem. This is because republics by nature are going to be of a large population spread across many regions, and there's going to be a small number of representatives as compared to the population, so mob rule will never be able to take root, and the temperament of the representatives will be milder and more cooperative among the different regions. This is in agreement with what Hamilton says about factions at the end of Federalist 9. There, he talks about how the beauty and genius of a republic lies in the fact that it has a very large population dispersed among different geographic regions, and because of their different material conditions, each region will have different interests, and thus no one faction will be able to take hold, and one that starts to take hold in one part of the Union will be able to be counteracted by the rest of the Union that is not under the influence of that faction. In short, rather than trying to homogenize a population, you can disperse them among so many people and regions and represent them with a small enough number of representatives as to keep a level head that a faction, even in the majority, should never be able to take hold, and the government, being informed by all people, should tend towards the public good of all. Now, by this time, you might have noticed that if you read this plan one way, it sounds like a genius way to prevent factions from taking hold of a government. But read another, it kind of sounds super evil. Isn't the point of a government to represent the majority's interests? Why would you create such a complicated system that prevents the majority from ever taking hold and expressing their opinion? Now, this is pretty complex, so we'll get back to it in the analysis. But for now, let's assume that Madison is not some supervillain and he's really working with the public good at heart. So, to understand him a little bit better, let's read a short passage. The effect of the first difference is, on the one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves, convened for the purpose. Now, he does go on to acknowledge right after that the opposite effect of what's intended might happen, and we might accidentally just give a faction a super secure seat of power. He goes on to describe how to protect yourself against the cabals of the few by finding the right proportion of representatives to citizens. On the one hand, in a small republic, the proportion of representatives to citizens must be kept high enough to diffuse factions and keep them from taking the majority hold of all of the representatives. While in large republics, you need to keep the number of representatives low enough that the Congress will continue to be effective and not be taken over by mob rule. Because of this, the proportion of representatives to citizens will be highest in a small republic and get lower as the republic grows larger. He also mentions that there's problems on both ends of this spectrum. If you have too few reps, then the district they represent will be too large and the community will feel too disconnected from the representative to ever be able to judge them correctly. Have too many reps, and you get the opposite effect where they're too engaged with the community and they're too focused on local issues to ever be able to figure out what the public good is for everybody. Because of these things, Madison really stresses that the right proportion of representatives based on the size of the population must always be maintained for the government to have any hope at truly representing the public good of the people. He finishes off this point by mentioning that the Constitution provides for a kind of happy medium here. It gives states the power to poll local representatives for local governance, keeping those interests where they should be, while also providing the largest possible pool of statesmen to be drawn from for the federal government. Madison finishes off Federalist 10 with a discussion of why the Union is so apt to enjoy all the benefits of a representative republic, while also mitigating all of the potential problems with popular government. This is because the Union was and still is so large. Just as a republic is better at reducing the influence of factions than a democracy is, better still is a larger republic than a smaller one. And the Union, then and now, is huge, so it should be really good at diffusing factions. Another reason for this is also the diversity of the interests within the United States. So to finish out this summary, I'm going to read to you from the second to last paragraph of this paper. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. You know the drill. That's the summary. Now it's time to move on to the analysis. So as I said at the start of the video, I think that this is one of the most important papers in the whole of the work. And I think so far in our series, it's tied or maybe just above Federalist 1 in terms of importance. Now, this isn't a controversial take. At the start of this copy that I have, there's a list of all the best papers, and 1 and 10 are definitely on there. And I agree. But I agree not because I'm just copying what they're saying. I agree because my analysis agrees with theirs. And the reason that I agree is because there's a common thread in both of these papers that history and myself have converged on, and that is the problem of individual interests. That's right. I'm not shutting up about individual interests because I think it's the most important problem that my generation is and will be dealing with from here on out. Madison calls them factions, but individual interests are basically the same thing. It's a group of people that will sacrifice the well-being of the Union for their own personal benefit. And anyone with a functioning brain should be able to see that individual interests have taken over everything in this country. Both political parties are bought out by corporate lobbyists. Foreign nations are doing the same thing. The top 1% own a third of all American wealth, and they use it to buy elections at home and abroad. They meddle in our government, they're privatizing all markets, they're doing everything they can to enslave the American people. And it seems like hardly anybody even notices. So I guess the question that you ask from there is why is the Constitution failing us? Madison seemed absolutely confident that the government that he framed out would hold true to the people's interests. So why hasn't it? Well, for starters, quite a lot has happened since they wrote the Constitution. At least 3 more industrial revolutions, a civil war, 2 world wars, a bunch of proxy wars, panics, recessions, depressions, about 7 billion more people on the planet, nuclear arms, globalization, digitalization, the commodification of everything, and more material wealth than at any point in history before this. As brilliant as they were, there's no chance they would have ever predicted half of that. I think the 2 things that have contributed most to the failing of the Constitution is a failure of adequate representation in proportion to the explosion of population as well as government lobbying. Madison spends a lot of time emphasizing how important it is to get the proportion of representatives to citizens correct. Without the proper proportion, you can never represent the people correctly. In 1789, there is about 1 House rep for every 57,000 people, with a total of 65 members. In the 1910s, the last time we expanded the House up to the current 435 members, there was about 1 rep for every 209,000 people. And today, with that same number of representatives, it's about 1 rep for every 750,000 people. And that comes from the Pew Research Center. That's the worst ratio for any developed nation on the planet. I think it's obvious that you can't actually represent the people of the United States with a proportion so out of whack. And I think that Madison makes it clear, as well as voter turnout, that people feel more disconnected than ever from the government that's supposed to represent them. I think expanding Congress would be the single thing that would do the most to fix the problems of our government today. Madison does point out that you can't have too many reps or else Congress won't function. According to the 2020 census, there's about 340 million Americans today, And so if you want representation to be equal to the 1789 level, you would need about 6,000 reps. And I'm just going to go out on a limb here and assume that that's probably too many. So if you wanted to bring it back down to the 1911 levels, we'd need about 1,600 reps. Now that feels a lot more doable, but the number that I had in my head before I ran the numbers was about 1,000. So I think somewhere between that 1,000 and that 1,600 would probably put us in a really good position, at least a lot better than we are now. It would make the people's voice way more powerful. The next thing is that we need to end lobbying and remove money from politics. This is like the most obvious thing you could say. It really doesn't even need to be argued, it's just self evident. We live in a classist system where you either need to be wealthy or do favors for the wealthy to get elected to the government. This is why our Congress is so corrupt. Buying elections is the standard. Lobbying doesn't just open the door, it knocks it clear off the hinges for factions and individual interests to run amok and just take over the government. Kat Abou-Ghazaleh is doing a terrific job at showing us what a modern, crowdsourced campaign looks like. She's great. Go subscribe to her channel and help her win her election. But at the end of the day, I think what would be golden is something like how Bernie Sanders describes, where you have a candidate who needs to say get the support of 100,000 people to get on a national ballot. And then once they get their name on the ballot, they get allotted a certain amount of money equal to all the other candidates to fund their campaign with. And from there, it would be a very fair, at least much more fair way to do politics than we have right now. So the next question is, how has a minority faction, that of the billionaires and one percenters, become so good at abusing the majority? I think the answer is somewhat obvious. It has to do with everything we've talked about up until this point in the series. That's not an exhaustive list, but I think we've done a pretty good job covering it. But at the end of the day, you could probably ask every American and get a completely unique answer of how we're getting fucked. There's also a point to be made about Jay's warnings from the second video, as well as Hamilton's warnings from the last video, about people running to institutions that erode their liberty and freedom. Think security capital after 9/11, or the way that the modern right is running to the tyrant's private police force today. The government's up for sale, point blank. And until we do something about it, we're cooked. But it's important to remember that we can do something about it. And the founders left us with incredible tools to be able to exert our influence in it. But we have to have the will and the vision to do so. The last thing that I'll touch on is whether Madison is a supervillain or not, and if representative government is actually an evil conspiracy to suppress the majority. This is one of the main criticisms of our federal government. The founders were a minority faction who created a system to keep power. It's a bourgeois revolution. I mean, they did specifically make it so only a white landowner could be elected in the beginning. This is a criticism normally levied by the left, and when I say that, I don't mean the make-believe left that exists in America today. I'm talking about like the red left. And there is some credence to it. The idea is basically what I said a second ago. Even though the American Revolution was progressive for its time, all the framers were white, upper class, landowning, many of them slave owning, bourgeois people who created a system that allowed their minority faction to stay in power. I mean, even Adam Smith, whose ideas they drew on heavily while creating the government, insists that whatever is good for the workers is good for the whole of society because the workers are the majority. So, what's up with our government then? Well, I can see where this idea is coming from. I'm just not convinced that it's the whole story. There's definitely hints of it in our federal system. After all, no one is completely immune to individual interests, not even the guys who wrote the Constitution. Reading their words makes me think that that's not the whole truth, though. Unless these guys were just completely lying in everything they did and were dying for that lie, they were truly interested in equality and liberty, no matter how flawed what they came up with is. And with that, that's all that I got for this one. This was one of my longest scripts, so I'm sure that it's going to be one of my longest videos. And the reason for that is because, even if nobody watches this video, I think this is one of the most important things I've ever read, and I wanted to do it justice. So I went all out for it. I learned so much making these videos. I have a lot of fun doing it, and I think everyone gets better as I go along. So yeah, I think it's gonna be my best yet. And other than that, I mean, Madison's the GOAT. I'm excited to read more of his stuff as we go along and bring you that information. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you learned something. And if you did, please leave a like, a comment, share the video with a friend, and please subscribe. It means a lot to me to see you guys engage and know that you guys got something of value out of this. So, with that, stay safe, stay curious, and stay united. See you guys in the next one.